Welcome to Wisconsin Water Week. Welcome to Tuesday morning's Habitat session. I want to take a moment to thank the sponsors for this morning's session, Wisconsin Lake and Pond Resources, LLC. My name is Jessica Hawkey and I will be the moderator for this session. Before we get started, I want to mention a couple things. Our speakers will answer questions if there's time after each talk. At the top right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a chat tab and a Q&A tab. If you'd like to ask our speakers a question, use the Q&A tab to type that in. Also, if you see a question you'd like and you want to vote for it, and there's limited time to answer the questions, I'll try to get to those questions first. So we're going to jump right into it. Our first speaker is Craig Thompson. Craig began his career with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources when gas was only 86 cents a gallon. As Chief of Program Integration for the DNR's Natural Heritage Conservation Program, he's responsible for managing bird conservation partnerships, the DNR's Important Bird Area Program, and the Wisconsin Migratory Stopover Initiative. Every year, Craig leads a conservation birding adventures to Latin America to support tropical forest protection, and he's never met a motmot he didn't like. So I'm really excited for this talk. Craig, if you want to start sharing your screen, we're excited to hear what you have to say.
Okay, so I've got a little bit of a glitch here in that I can't find my start bar.
It's down there on the right-hand side. Just hit that little, yep, right there.
There we
Exactly.
go. Okay, excellent.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right, you bet.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Very happy to be here. Thank you to Jessica for that introduction. I am pleased to be able to share with you some information about what's going on in the world big picture wise as it relates to species loss and how you as riparian landowners actually have an opportunity to make a difference. And so what I want to do is start very big picture, provide perspective on, as I indicated, on the global erosion of species that is one of the world's great challenges at this point, and then step it down to the riparian landowner. And as it relates to the content of this talk, this is really more about the why as opposed to the how. So with that, we know that there's an extinction crisis. So I actually consider this to be one of the two great global challenges that we as a civilization face. In some respects, from my perspective, extinction is even a greater problem than climate change, not to diminish the importance of climate change. It's critically important that we get a handle on it. But theoretically, at least, climate change is reversible. Extinction is not. And so as we lose species, that's a permanent diminishment of the fabric that holds the planet together. And you can see that some, including BBC back in June of last year, actually characterized the extinction crisis as an existential threat. Birds are perhaps the greatest manifestation of, the most visible manifestation of species loss across the planet. And in fact, that's happening right in our backyard. So what we know is that since 1970, we have lost almost a third of North America's birds, about 3 billion species. And these losses are across all of the taxa. What I mean by that is there are species that have traditionally been rare that are diminishing, some precipitously, but even common species like grackles and robins are declining. And when we see birds that are considered to be excellent environmental indicators in steep decline, we know that something is awry with the environment. And so what we need to do is get a handle on that. What we don't want is to have future generations look at us and go, well, gee whiz, they didn't do enough and they didn't do it fast enough. And so, we don't want to have to apologize for the mass extinction that's currently underway. I do believe with as dire as the situation is, we still have an opportunity to have a positive impact and turn that trajectory around. So how exactly do we do that? What's cooking from a big picture perspective? The Half Earth Project is a construct of the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation. And Half Earth basically says we need to save half of the planet and set aside, in fact, half of the planet for the wild things that co-inhabit the Earth with us, because that then will lead to healthy ecosystems and, in fact, the ability of the Earth's life support systems to continue to provide meaningful ecological services for all of us that depend on them. There is, however, a movement afoot that is trying to accelerate things by having shorter goals and perhaps more achievable goals short term, and that's the WE's Campaign for Nature. And the WE's Campaign for Nature, and perhaps you've heard about it as it relates to the Biden administration actually embracing this approach, is also called the 30 by 30 campaign. And the intent is to save 30% of the planet Earth, the terrestrial landmass, and 30% of our marine ecosystems, so that we, by 2030, a mere 9 years from now, so that we can actually have a base of viable ecosystems from which to extend protections and management so that we can make the Earth livable into the future. Well, what it boils down to, though, is those big constructs provide sideboards for us to consider how to do conservation. They set lofty goals for us to try to achieve, and the intent is for those big picture perspectives to bring us all forward in a unified direction, to try to make sure we're all pulling the rope in the same way. But what it boils down to, I think, as all of you know, is conservation ultimately is local. So what happens in a yard, what happens along a lake shore, what happens in that riparian corridor adjacent to the river is vitally important, not only as it relates to saving species at those sites, but also as it contributes to the larger conservation efforts that are now crystallizing across the planet. So that's where you as riparian landowners come in. You have a critically important role to play because of the nature of riparian habitats. These interfaces, these ecotones, these environmental gradients that run from wet to dry are among the most biologically productive habitats on Earth. They're vitally important for a host of species, and they underpin ecosystem function in many respects. And so, as riparian landowners, you have not only enormous responsibility, but also significant opportunity to really have a positive impact on what's going on in regard to species, not only species maintenance, but ecosystem health on the planet. These ecotones, as I had mentioned, are incredibly important for food chain support. So what we see in riparian areas is you get a lot of aquatic insect emergence on a continuous basis, except in the dead of winter. But even now, I suspect with the warming temperatures outside, we're starting to get insect hatch. I've seen a few bugs flying around our house, in fact, over the last couple of days. And as you get these emergent insects coming out of these aquatic environments, you have, of course, predators that start to concentrate there to feed on these. And so what you have between this water upland interface, or at this water upland interface, high concentrations of prey items that are coming out of the water, high densities of spiders that are coming in to feed on those prey items. And because you have this rich mix of invertebrates, these areas are vitally important for songbirds, particularly species like this warbling vireo, which I suspect many of you that are riparian landowners actually have on your properties. Now, true to the vireo group of birds, this little group of migratory birds, they're not great to look at in terms of being stunners visually, but they have terrific songs. And this particular species is a signature riparian inhabitant, and you can often hear its ascending raspy whistle throughout the summer. I won't embarrass myself by actually trying to do it, but suffice it to say, I'll bet you've heard it, and if someone pointed it out to you, if you don't know what it is, you'd probably go, oh, I've been hearing that for quite some time. These vireos inhabit these upland-wetland interfaces because they're so protein-rich with the aquatic emergent insects and the associated spiders that are there. And so what we have is very high productivity, or the potential for high bird productivity in these riparian areas. Now, what I want to talk about is 7 simple actions that you can take to help songbirds. So to back up just a skosh, we know that birds are in steep decline. so steep, in fact, that this has become an issue of global importance. And we know that there are big initiatives that are out there, but it's going to take all of us to contribute to those initiatives to not only stem species loss for all of the attacks across the planet, but particularly for those birds that inhabit our properties, our yards, and our riparian areas. So if we look down, and I'm just going to go around the horn very quickly, but what I want to focus on ultimately is the use of native plants. But if we go around counterclockwise, starting in the lower left, drink shade-grown coffee. So you can buy any industrial coffee off the shelf at a grocery store, but I encourage you to find something that's characterized as shade-grown, because it's grown in the shade and forests in Latin America. And with the extensive loss of tropical forests, shade-grown coffee plantations are becoming surrogate forests for our migratory birds. And so you can actually start every morning with a cup of conservation. If we move up to the left, you can see reduced pesticide use, reduced plastic use. That's self-explanatory. I don't need to spend any time on that. Do citizen science is next. That's actually getting out there and paying attention to what's in your yard, recording the bumblebees you see, making notes on the butterflies that arrive, and even more to the point as it relates to the topic of this presentation, recording those bird species that you see, because citizen science is proving to be a very powerful tool for helping us to track changes in bird populations. So to the extent that you get involved in that, you're contributing to the science that helps drive conservation. At the top, make windows safer. We know that there are a number of drivers of species loss. This actually happens to be number 3. It's thought, number 2, it's thought that perhaps 1 billion birds a year are hitting and dying on windows. And so there are things that you can do to modify that reflective surface to make it less attractive to birds so they can actually see it. Otherwise, they just simply don't recognize the glass. They smack into the glass as they're flying, and we see a lot of mortality associated with that. That's one of the things that we can actually do as not only riparian landowners, but landowners in general. At about 1 o'clock, just to the right of the wood thrush calling, keep cats indoors. Cats are probably the number 3 loss. Outdoor cats are the number 3 driver of bird loss across North America. And we know that cats are wonderful animals, but they're also exceptionally efficient predators. It's another cause of mortality that we have the ability to rein in. Use native plants, and that's really what I want to focus on today. So native plants are proving to be an extremely important consideration as it relates to ecosystem health, and particularly as it relates to maintaining species on the landscape. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. And then finally, you can see in the lower right at about 5 o'clock, avoid pesticide use, vitally important. We know that there are extensive losses of not only birds, but particularly the insects that birds feed on. While the causal agents of insect loss are not fully understood, there is growing evidence that suggests that extensive pesticide use, particularly neonicotinoids, are really having a significant impact in driving insect numbers down, which is diminishing the amount of food that's out there for birds. So just a healthy environment in general, you want to reduce pesticide use. It's good for the critters, it's good for us. So what about this restoring riparian environments with native plants? This is a very typical lakeside dwelling where you can see that the shoreline has been modified. There's an extensive area of lawn. There's a dock and things to support boats and that aquatic lifestyle, but there's not a lot of habitat. That's what's really missing from a photograph like this. And the beauty of a situation like this is I look at a lakeside dwelling like this and think, this is a blank canvas. There's great opportunity here to restore this, to not only make it biologically functional, but also to make it just aesthetically stunning. And I have a couple of examples of what those things look like. And what we want to do then is go native. And what I mean by that is plant native trees, plant native forbs and grasses, and plant native shrubs. And it's literally a situation where if you build it, they will come. My wife and I have spent a great deal of time, we live on Alaska, and we've spent a great deal of time naturalizing our yard, and the response that we've gotten from wildlife is astonishing, particularly from birds. This is really easy to do, it's very gratifying, and it's really constructive in terms of helping to stem species loss. So this is now a lake dwelling that has been a lakeside home that has been a completely restored, naturalized lakeshore environment. You can see there's very little lawn. There's emergent vegetation coming out of the littoral zone adjacent to the shoreline. And there are a variety of trees and shrubs that are throughout the property. This is a very rich habitat. And this is still a habitat that provides recreational opportunities and in a great aesthetic setting. So actually you can have your cake and eat it too as it relates to restoring riparian areas. Why are we so concerned? There have been studies that have been done recently. When I say recently, I mean within the last couple of years, that indicate you need to have at least 70% native vegetation in your yard in order to sustain viable populations of native songbirds. This happens to be a gray catbird, a common inhabitant of riparian areas in Wisconsin. What we mean by that is 7 out of 10 species in your yard need to be native to Wisconsin. And that's because those native species support the insects that these birds need to feed their young and to sustain themselves. Anything less than 70% native vegetation, when we introduce non-native spruce, when we're bringing in all kinds of shrubs from Europe or Asia, bugs can't feed on those. And so birds are living in biological deserts for the most part in cities and suburban areas because we have a tendency to landscape with things that are not native. So think of that, 7 out of 10 plants in your yard need to be native to make your yard truly biologically productive. And when you exceed that threshold is when things really start to manifest themselves in terms of a positive development for all kinds of wildlife that you're welcoming to your yard. This Baltimore oriole is another classic riparian zone inhabitant. This is a traditional neotropical migrant, as we refer to it, a bird that you can see its breeding range here in red in the summer, its migratory range in yellow, so that's where it occurs just during migration, either headed north or headed south. But the key here is that if you see the blue down in Central America and northwestern South America, you can see a lot of blue. That's the winter range for this bird. And what that means is these birds are traveling thousands of miles and spending the entire winter out of Wisconsin, away from our riparian areas. And there are all kinds of challenges, as I had mentioned, that are going on in the tropics in terms of tropical forest loss. So to the extent that we can help create better breeding habitats here and concurrently develop strategies working with countries like Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama to protect forests there, we can paint a rosier future for Baltimore orioles and the more than half of all of the species in North America, more than 300 in fact, that depend on tropical forests for survival. So what do we know? We know that the birds are being squeezed on their breeding grounds, they're being squeezed on their wintering grounds, and as a result, we're seeing these, again, catastrophic losses of species, 2.5 billion migratory birds lost since 1970. That's almost half of our Baltimore orioles. And to me, there's almost no bird that signifies the return of spring more than a Baltimore oriole. I think a ruby-throated hummingbird is a close second. But I would hate to think future generations would not be able to enjoy the sights and sounds of these spectacular birds. But we really have the opportunity then to turn things around with hemispheric strategies and from our own personal perspective, beginning right here in your riparian yards. So a couple of things that I want to mention that are typically overlooked. So we know we want to plant native species. Dead wood is really important for a variety of things, not only insects, but also birds. There's an inclination to take down the dead trees. If you can safely leave the dead trees, if you can safely leave dead limbs on trees, that is so that they don't pose a safety hazard for you, you're going to find all kinds of wildlife that are going to move into these things. And these dead trees and riparian zones are vitally important for a host of species, particularly things like tree swallows, which, by the way, are also declining. Planting fruiting trees and shrubs is also exceptionally important because if we bring those fruiting trees and shrubs in, not only are those native fruiting trees and shrubs, not only are those trees and shrubs growing bugs, but they're growing fruit, which provides species like this cedar waxwing all kinds of not only food in the winter, but particularly food during migration, the most energy intensive portion of the bird's annual cycle. From a shrub standpoint, a number of species are highly recommended: viburnums, dogwoods, elderberries. That's highlighted because you can see the elderberries on the right, and of course serviceberries. And again, I've had experience with planting all of these species in their yard. They're magnets for birds once they mature. This is really an easy, fun thing you can do in your riparian habitats in order to bring in wildlife and in order to make your yards ever so more productive for the wildlife species, and particularly birds that need those kinds of healthy habitats. If you want to get into the nuts and bolts of what's going on in terms of shoreland restoration, UW Extension has a number of excellent publications which can really walk you through the ABCs about how to get it done, starting with, this is what I have, this is how you begin to make transitions, here are plants for consideration no matter what environment you're working in. And I encourage you as riparian landowners to actually take a look at those extension publications, because they are quite good in terms of being manuals for riparian restoration. So the bottom line is that you as riparian landowners have an enormously important role to play, not only in terms of making your immediate habitats more productive, but also in terms of contributing to these larger goals of stemming the global erosion of species that's going on. You can see this domesticated house and boathouse on the left, and then the rewilded house and boathouse on the right. It's a spectacular transition. It's a biologically productive transition. And I want to point out that not only have they rewilded their property, their shoreline just looks great on the right, but notice how they also took care of the aesthetic concerns of the color of the boathouse. So they're really blending in here, and it's really about us becoming more harmonious and laying gently on the land as we enjoy what it has to offer, but we also provide the opportunity for species to co-inhabit those areas with us. So there's great opportunity to have a huge impact. It's easy to do, it's gratifying, and it's something that you as riparian landowners, again, can play an important role in stemming the loss of species. I love the quote from Dr. Thomas Lovejoy of the Smithsonian Institution, which really for me sums it all up. If you take care of birds, you take care of most of the big problems in the world. So thank you for your time today. I hope you'll consider restoring your riparian habitat if you haven't, and if you have, I hope you'll consider sharing what you've done with others, because you really can have a tremendous impact. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Craig. That was really a great presentation. I'm inspired to do some native planting on my property. We've got a couple really good questions here. The first question, do you have any recommendations for effective and inexpensive solutions to make windows safer for birds?
Yes, and yes, there are things that you can do that are relatively inexpensive that make windows almost 100% safer for birds. So what I would suggest is you can contact me at craig.thompson@wisconsin.gov, and I'll be happy to send information to you. That's craig.thompson, THOMPSON, @wisconsin.gov, and I will send information to you. But here's what I can tell you. My wife and I have treated when we moved into our house north of La Crosse, there were they have, nice windows, lots of windows, very reflective. There were birds dying all over the place. It was mortifying. We were just beside ourselves. We have since treated our windows with something called Acopian, ACOPIAN bird savers, Acopian bird savers. And they're basically lengths of paracord, the stuff that you use for parachutes, that we cut and dangle down over the windows, and they're black, and so they're aesthetically almost invisible. And they break up that reflective surface, and we've gone from many bird kills in a year to virtually 0 bird strikes, which has been an enormously gratifying response. So we've basically taken a house that was a bird killer and turned it into something that's now benign. And any landowner can do that. I've helped lots of friends do that. I helped my mom do that. It is darn near 100% effective. Now, there are some other things too that I'd be happy to share with you, but Acopian bird savers is a really great way to treat your windows to reduce mortality and also to not impact the aesthetics, because aesthetics, what your windows look like, both looking in from the outside and out from the inside, makes a big difference to landowners. It does to us. We're very happy with this.
Great. That's great. Thank you. We have another question here. What's your preferred way to minimize deer and rabbit browsing on new native plantings?
Oh man, that's a tough one. That is very tough. There is no good way to do that. So you're either running outside with spray bottles and spraying with repellents, some of which have to be reapplied after every rain, or you're fencing. And so, we live in an area with very high deer populations, and what I've had to do with a lot of our native stuff, because deer, they're wily and they will eat everything. And so I've been told that there are some things that are deer proof. I haven't found anything yet that they won't try at least once. So with areas that are restored, I'm fencing them and hoping that the deer population will eventually take care of itself ultimately. But short of fencing or short of repellents, I'm sorry, I don't have a silver bullet for you. It continues to be a very vexing problem in areas with high deer populations.
Yes, and we've noticed the same thing. Okay, well, maybe one more question here. We mentioned that saving half of the earth or pursuing 30 by 30 should be our goal. Should the land and water we conserve/preserve be large and contiguous rather than fractured?
Oh, that's a great question. So it gets to the issue of habitat fragmentation. And so, yes, the answer is yes, to the extent that we can have large continuous or contiguous habitats that are not interrupted by roads, by sidewalks, by mowed lawns, and so on, so much the better. So if you look at any suburban area, and if you can imagine that area being, all of those yards being naturalized, the amount of habitat that can be generated in a yard, if everybody did even only half of their yard, and if those yards were then connected habitat-wise, the result would be a staggering and productive in terms of wildlife habitat. So yes, the bigger the better. I mean, it's kind of like the big rule of thumb now is go big or go home as it relates to ecosystem protection. And so what we're striving for is to put all of these properties, to stitch all these properties together in a big conservation quilt, but it takes individual landowners to be willing to do that. So that was a great question, and to the extent that we can all work together to create bigger blocks of habitat, so much the better.
Great. Yes, I totally agree with that. Okay, there's a few more questions here, but I think we should move on to our next speaker, just so I can make some other announcements here. And if you all want to ask these questions, please go to the speaker tab and you can find Craig and ask him personally, or you can send him an email. I think you're fine with that, right, Craig?
Absolutely. Happy to do it. Thank you, everybody. Have a good week.
Okay.